Every profound transformation begins with the dissolution of an earlier form of life. There comes a particular kind of silence that feels almost sacred in its heaviness, the silence that arrives when the script of your life suddenly tears apart. It's not the peace of a quiet morning or the stillness after prayer. It's the kind that hums beneath the noise of your daily routine, the kind that whispers, "This isn't working anymore." You wake up one morning and realize that the job that once filled you with direction now feels mechanical, hollow, like repeating lines from a play you no longer believe in. The friendships that once brought you laughter now feel like scenes from another lifetime. Even your reflection seems like a stranger's face, familiar in outline but empty in essence. The rhythm that used to move your days suddenly collapses, and something deep within you begins to ask a question that can't be ignored. What happened to me? This question doesn't come from the mind. It rises from a deeper place, from the soul that has quietly watched you living a version of yourself that no longer fits. Jung once wrote that many neuroses begin when a person clings to a pattern of life that has already lost its meaning. When the outer life no longer reflects the truth of the inner world, the psyche revolts. It pulls the rug from beneath the illusions we built, forcing us to stop pretending that comfort is the same as purpose. What feels like breakdown is often breakthrough in disguise, the moment when the unconscious demands transformation. Life, which once seemed linear and predictable, begins to move in spirals, leading us back to forgotten parts of ourselves that we once buried for the sake of belonging. Imagine living inside an old house. Every wall still stands. The furniture sits where it always has, but the air inside feels stale, dense with the scent of things long dead. The windows are closed tight, the curtains heavy with dust, and though everything remains familiar, you feel a strange disconnection. You know this place. You built it. Yet every step echoes like you're trespassing in your own life. That's what it's like when you've outgrown the emotional architecture that once held you. The roof still shelters you, but the walls have become too close, too narrow for your expanding soul. You long to breathe, to open a window, to feel sunlight again, but fear whispers that if you leave, everything will collapse. And so you stay. You polish the same floors, replay the same roles, hoping the sense of aliveness might return. But it doesn't, because the soul cannot be convinced to shrink back into comfort once it has tasted truth. The deeper self, the one Jung called the self, large in the ego, begins to knock on the door of your awareness. It doesn't use words, but symptoms. Fatigue that no amount of sleep can cure. Restlessness in moments that used to bring joy. Anxiety that doesn't respond to logic. These are not enemies to defeat, but messengers of change. They come to say, the old story is over. We try to hold it together. The routines, the identity, the mask. But deep down, something sacred is already unraveling. The universe has its own rhythm for rebirth, and it rarely asks for our consent. That's why this silence feels so unbearable. It's the sound of the old self dissolving, the echo of your psyche clearing space for something new. And though it feels like loss, what's really dying is a version of you that kept pretending. The collapse isn't failure, it's initiation. It's the first crack through which light begins to enter. Jung saw individuation as this precise moment, when the conscious ego begins to surrender control and allow the deeper intelligence of the soul to lead. You aren't losing your way, you're being rerouted toward your wholeness. But what happens when you ignore that inner call? When you silence the voice that says, you've changed, and keep performing a role that no longer fits? What happens when you keep living inside that old house, even as its foundation begins to crumble? A crisis rarely arrives politely. It doesn't send a warning or ask for permission. It enters uninvited, dismantling the careful order of your days and tearing through the life you once thought was solid. Suddenly, the plans that once felt certain begin to fall apart. The map you trusted no longer leads anywhere, and the person you were so sure you were begins to dissolve. You tell yourself it's just stress, bad luck, or a temporary phase. But deep down, something older, something wiser, is moving beneath the surface. Because when the life you plan no longer fits, it isn't chaos that's speaking. It's your unconscious, patiently, persistently, beginning to rewrite your story. Jung called this the compensatory function of the psyche, the hidden intelligence that restores what consciousness has neglected. Every time you live too long in one direction, too rational, too busy, too perfect, too in control, the unconscious pushes back, balancing what's been denied. It's not malicious. It's merciful. It speaks through dreams that unsettle you, through fatigue that won't be cured by sleep, through coincidences that feel like signs. It uses symbols instead of words and crises instead of logic, because it knows you've stopped listening to whispers. What we call breakdown, the psyche calls correction. There was once a woman who built her life on strength. The kind of strength the world praises, reliable, capable, the one everyone turned to when things fell apart. She carried everyone else's burdens, believing that needing help was weakness. For years she lived like this, keeping her pain in quiet corners, telling herself that everything was fine, until one morning her body refused to get up. The hands that once held everything began to tremble. Her chest felt heavy, her heart pounded for no reason, and tears came without warning. Doctors told her it was exhaustion, but the truth was deeper. Her soul had been silenced for too long. Her crisis was not punishment. It was communication. The body had become the voice of the unconscious, saying what the mind could no longer deny. You've been strong for too long. You've forgotten how to be alive. What she mistook for failure was, in fact, a sacred interruption. It was life pulling her away from a pattern that had lost its meaning. Jung believed that the unconscious doesn't destroy, it compensates. When consciousness becomes too one-sided, the psyche intervenes to restore equilibrium. That's why the woman's body collapsed. Not to betray her, but to balance her. What looked like falling apart was, in truth, a reordering. And maybe you felt that, too. The moment when everything you built starts to tremble. When the job, the relationship, the identity that once made sense begins to feel unbearably tight. We call it burnout or depression, but often it's a deeper movement. The self tries to return to its natural rhythm. Jung wrote in The Nature of the Psyche, "Our civilized life demands such a directed activity of consciousness that we end up distancing ourselves from the unconscious, and it is from this very separation that crises are born. The more we chase control, the further we drift from the life within us. And the further we drift, the louder the unconscious becomes. Sometimes it speaks softly, through restlessness or boredom. Sometimes it shouts, through illness, heartbreak, or loss. It dismantles the structures we worship, so we can remember what's real. That's why the world often confuses awakening with catastrophe. Because the first act of the soul's renewal is always destruction, not who you are, but of who you pretend to be. The woman's tears were not weakness. They were her soul's thawing. Her body, once burdened by duty, was teaching her how to surrender. The crisis that once terrified her became the threshold to freedom. So ask yourself, how many times have you resisted what felt like loss, only to find out later it was life itself guiding you? How many times have you mourned what ended, not realizing it was clearing space for what was true? Every ending carries a seed of realignment. Every detour hides the map back to yourself. The unconscious doesn't want your obedience. It wants your wholeness. It will use whatever means necessary to bring you back to balance, even if it means breaking what you thought was unbreakable. Because transformation doesn't come through comfort. It comes when everything you relied on stops working, forcing you to look beyond survival and toward meaning. That's the gift of the crisis. It exposes what you've outgrown and reveals the self that's been waiting underneath all along. But if the unconscious is always trying to restore us, if it is the unseen force guiding us back to authenticity, why do we feel so much guilt when we finally choose to change direction? Guilt is a strange companion, heavy, invisible, persuasive. It creeps in whenever you start to change, whispering that you're being selfish, ungrateful, or irresponsible for wanting something different. You take one step toward freedom, and guilt pulls you back, reminding you of all the people you might disappoint. But guilt isn't truth. It's the echo of an old self trying to survive. Psychologically, guilt often appears as resistance to growth. The ego, terrified of losing control, mistakes transformation for betrayal. It tells you that leaving the familiar means abandoning everything and everyone you've ever loved. Yet what's really happening is that your consciousness, long identified with who you thought you were, begins to fear the death of its own illusion. Jung understood this mechanism well. He saw guilt not as a moral flaw, but as a symptom of transition, a tension between the old personality and the one struggling to be born. The consciousness that clings to its habits wants to remain coherent, consistent, predictable. It worships the illusion of control. But the unconscious doesn't care for appearances. It wants wholeness. When life begins to shift, the ego panics, because it can no longer play the part that once kept it safe. It's like standing on a stage, under bright lights, realizing that the script you memorized no longer fits the story being told. This is the moment when the persona, the social mask we build to survive, begins to crack. Jung described the persona as the face we wear for the world, polite, competent, likable, controlled. It's necessary, he said, because we all need a way to function within society. But when the mask hardens, when we start believing we are that mask, the soul begins to suffocate beneath it. Jung warned, he who is completely identified with the role he plays loses his soul in the process. The collapse of the life you planned is not random misfortune. It's the dismantling of that mask. It's the psyche's way of saying, you were never meant to live only as a role. You can see this every day. The professional who stays in a job that drains him because status feels safer than authenticity. The marriage that continues not out of love, but out of fear of what people will say if it ends. The woman who denies her own longing just to keep being the good daughter. Responsible, agreeable, easy to love. Each of them carries a silent weight of guilt, mistaking loyalty for life. They confuse pleasing others with being whole. And though they appear composed, something in their eyes reveals the quiet despair of self-abandonment. We often call this loyalty or stability, but psychologically, it's paralysis. It's the ego defending its illusion of coherence, the need to appear consistent at any cost. Because if you change, people might question you. If you stop performing the role, who will you be? This is why transformation feels like guilt. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're breaking an internal contract written by fear. The persona's job is to protect you from rejection, but its tragedy is that it also protects you from yourself. And so, guilt becomes a bodyguard of the false self. It stands at the door of your becoming, convincing you to stay small, polite, predictable. Yet beneath it all, the unconscious keeps whispering, you're allowed to evolve. You're allowed to step away from a version of you that the world applauds if it no longer holds your truth. The collapse of your old life is not punishment. It's liberation. The mask is falling not because you failed, but because it has served its purpose. But there's a subtler danger hidden here, one that most people never see until it's too late. It's the temptation to mistake the collapse for the end, when in reality, it's the beginning of reconstruction. There comes a point when holding things together becomes its own kind of illness. You keep pretending, keep performing, keep rebuilding the same walls that already collapsed until the weight of it begins to press inward. What once was strength turns into exhaustion. What once was discipline turns into anxiety. You wake up tired, go to bed restless, and in between, something inside you whispers what you've been avoiding. This version of your life is already over. Yet you resist, because admitting that truth would mean letting go of the identity you spent years constructing. This resistance has a cost. When we refuse to release what's dying, our psychic energy, what Jung called libido, the creative life force, begins to turn against itself. Instead of moving outward toward growth, it implodes inward, feeding on the very person it was meant to sustain. That's when symptoms appear. The burnout that sleep can't fix, the panic that has no cause, the strange hollowness that no success can fill. The psyche starts to speak in the only language it has left, through suffering. The pain isn't random. It's a message. Your soul isn't trying to destroy you. It's trying to free you. Imagine a tree that has outgrown its pod. Its roots coil tighter and tighter, circling the same small space until they begin to strangle each other. The tree doesn't wither because it lacks life. It withers because it has no room left to expand. That's what happens when your inner life tries to grow beyond the limits of the self you've outgrown. The energy that once nurtured your ambitions now starts to suffocate them. The soil that once felt safe becomes a cage. You can't keep pruning the leaves and pretending it's enough. You need to break the pot. Jung saw these inner collapses not as failures, but as calls from the self, the organizing center of the psyche, summoning us toward greater authenticity. The self doesn't care about the ego's definitions of success or control. It seeks integration, wholeness, truth. When you resist its pull, you're not defying life. You're refusing your own destiny. Every symptom, every breakdown, every sleepless night becomes a spiritual summons. Come closer to who you really are. Jung reminded us that the self will not stop calling, even if it must use suffering as its messenger. It's easy to misread these moments as punishment, but in truth, they're preparation. The unconscious never destroys out of cruelty. It dismantles to liberate. It pulls away what no longer aligns with your inner truth, so that something deeper can emerge. Jung wrote in the archetypes and the collective unconscious. Every profound transformation begins with the dissolution of an earlier form of life. That dissolution feels like chaos, but it's sacred chaos, the kind that loosens what has become too rigid, too controlled, too small for the soul's unfolding. If you find yourself in that place, where everything once solid is breaking, where your mind feels like a battlefield and your heart aches for something unnamed, know this: you are not falling apart. You are being replanted. The soil is shifting, the container cracking, because your roots are searching for open ground. The anxiety, the fatigue, the emptiness, they are not signs of failure. They are proof that life is still moving in you, even when you can't yet see where it's leading. The unconscious dismantles before it renews. The self allows endings so that beginnings can take root. What feels like loss is often the first stage of freedom. The tree doesn't know it's growing when the pot breaks. It only feels the pain of rupture. But without that break, it could never reach the sky. Still, the question remains, one that every soul in transformation eventually faces. How do you cross that passage without losing yourself completely? There's a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when you finally stop running and face what's left of your old life. The denial fades, the noise settles, and what remains is the raw truth. The old path is over. This is the first step of transformation, recognition. Jung believed that no real change begins until we acknowledge that something has died. You can't heal a wound you refuse to see. Recognition is a turning point where resistance ends and dialogue begins. It's when you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" Once you recognize the ending, the next step is listening, not to the world, but to the symbolic language of your own soul. The psyche speaks in images, dreams, and synchronicities, moments that seem random yet shimmer with meaning. Jung called this the symbolic function of the unconscious, the way the self communicates through symbols when words fail. You might dream of a broken bridge, a locked door, or a child calling your name. These are not coincidences. They're messages. The emotions that rise unexpectedly, the tears during a song, the unease and silence, the sudden memory that won't let go, are also ways the self tries to guide you. The more you listen without judgment, the clearer the pattern becomes. Then comes integration, perhaps the most challenging and sacred part of the process. It's the moment you turn toward your shadow, everything you've denied, repressed, or projected onto others. Jung saw the shadow not as evil, but as the unlived life within us. It contains the qualities we rejected to remain acceptable: our anger, vulnerability, desire, and truth. To integrate the shadow is to stop pretending you're only light. It's to sit at the table with your contradictions and say, "You too belong here." This dialogue between opposites, between who you are and who you hide, births something new. And from that tension emerges what Jung called a transcendent function, the living bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. It's not a theory, but a movement of the soul, a dynamic process through which the opposites within us find a higher harmony. It's the psyche's natural way of healing itself, creating a third path when the old dualities can no longer sustain growth. In this stage, meaning begins to return. You start to sense a quiet alignment, a feeling that your inner and outer worlds are no longer in conflict, but in conversation. Practically, this process doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. Write about what's dying in your life instead of pretending it's still alive. Sit in silence each morning, even for a few minutes, and let what you feel speak before you silence it with distractions. Allow yourself to not know, to dwell in uncertainty, without rushing for answers. Growth is less about adding new beliefs and more about unlearning what was never true. When you stop trying to control the outcome, life begins to reveal what it's been trying to show you all along. In Jungian terms, this is a path toward individuation, not the pursuit of becoming someone new, but the courage to return to who you've always been beneath conditioning. It's the soul's homecoming. The function transcendent is a bridge, but walking it takes humility. You don't conquer the unconscious. You collaborate with it. You learn to trust that even confusion has meaning, that even silence is fertile ground. And yet before true integration can take root, the psyche offers one last test, the most deceptive one of all, because once you taste inner truth, the ego finds a new disguise to wear. It learns to call itself spiritual. It seeks to escape pain by pretending it's enlightened. And so the question arises, how do you continue this journey without losing yourself in the illusion of transcendence, mistaking escape for evolution? The beginning of a new life rarely feels like light. More often, it feels like standing among the ruins, unsure of what can still be rebuilt. You start to sense glimpses of clarity, moments of peace, and you think, maybe this is it, maybe I've finally awakened. But the path of rebirth carries its own hidden snares, subtle illusions that can quietly pull you back into the very patterns you thought you'd escaped. Jung warned that the psyche, when touched by the numinous, easily slips into what he called inflation, the mistaken belief that contact with the divine makes the ego divine too. The first trap is the spiritual ego. It's that quiet seduction that tells you understanding is the same as transformation. You read, you reflect, you connect the dots, and suddenly the mind feels illuminated. But insight without embodiment is just another defense. Knowing that you have a shadow isn't the same as sitting with it. Understanding love isn't the same as loving. The ego, clever and subtle, rebrands itself as awakened, wearing humility as a mask for superiority. You start to believe you've transcended others, when in truth, you've only built a more refined version of the same old cage. True spirituality doesn't elevate you above others. It roots you deeper into your humanity. Then comes the subtle isolation. After tasting inner truth, the world can feel too loud, too shallow, too messy. You begin to withdraw, not from wisdom, but from life. You call it boundaries, discernment, solitude. Yet beneath it hides fear. Fear of being touched by the world's imperfection. Fear of losing the fragile peace you found. The soul longs for stillness, yes, but not separation. Jung believed that individuation was never about retreating from humanity. It was about bringing the inner transformation back into relationship with it. The self doesn't isolate, it integrates. The flower that grows in silence must eventually open to the sun. The third trap wears the face of compassion, the savior complex. After walking through your own awakening, you feel compelled to rescue others from their pain. It begins nobly but quietly. The ego slips back in, disguised as purpose. You start measuring your worth by how much you can fix. You try to become light for everyone else, forgetting that real light doesn't convert. It reveals. Jung observed that we cannot save others from their own unconscious. We can only walk beside them while they discover it themselves. The true healer isn't the one who cures, but the one who mirrors presence, the one who reminds others they are capable of saving themselves. And then there's regression, the most deceptive of all. After so much change, the longing for familiarity can turn into nostalgia for pain. You start romanticizing the past, telling yourself that at least you knew who you were when you were. Suffering. You replay old memories, revisit old habits, and call it reflection when it's really retreat. But the past isn't home anymore. It's a lesson. You can visit it for wisdom, but you can't live there. The soul doesn't want you to go backward. It wants you to grow roots in new soil. Each of these traps is a different mask of the same fear. The fear of living fully as your new self. There are evasions dressed as enlightenment, safety disguised as depth. But real transformation, Jung taught, doesn't glorify the enlightened self, it humanizes. The function transcendent isn't about escaping into higher realms. It's about reconciling heaven and earth within you. It's not ascension, it's integration. When the ego finally stops trying to control or idealize the process and allows itself to be corrected by the unconscious, something entirely new emerges. It's not the old self, and it's not some perfect ideal. It's alive, authentic, whole. And when that integration finally happens, when the opposites within you cease fighting and begin to dance. The being who rises from that silence is no longer the same one who began the journey. At first, it doesn't look like transformation at all. After the storm, there's no trumpet sound announcing your rebirth, no great revelation, just silence. The same silence that once terrified you now feels strangely kind. You wake up, make coffee, step outside, and notice how the light hits differently. The world hasn't changed, yet something in you has. The chaos that once felt unbearable has quieted, not because life is suddenly perfect, but because you've stopped resisting what it's trying to become through you. Healing rarely arrives with fireworks. It moves like dawn, slow and certain, painting light over the ruins. This is the stage Jung described as a reconciliation between consciousness and the unconscious. When the war inside you softens into dialogue, you no longer reject your shadows. You learn from them. The pain that once drove you to despair now becomes proof that you're alive and still capable of feeling deeply. The voice that used to whisper you're lost now says you're being remade. For the first time, you don't need to fix the moment. You simply live it. That's the first sign of integration. When peace stops depending on control. Think of it like a serpent shedding its skin. The process isn't graceful. The old layer doesn't fall away easily. It stretches, tears, clings to what's familiar. But the serpent doesn't resist. It rubs against the rough edges of the earth until what's old gives way to what's waiting beneath. It knows that pain is part growth, that suffocation means it's time to expand. The skin that once protected now restricts. The shedding looks like loss, but it's the only way life can continue. You, too, have been rubbing against the edges of your past, your fears, your stories. Every crack in your armor, every heartbreak, every ending, all was the friction required for your own renewal. Jung wrote in The Man and His Symbols, man can only become whole through the knowledge and acceptance of his own unconscious. This is the essence of rebirth, not escaping what's dark, but embracing it until it becomes part of your light. You've spent so long running from your wounds, not realizing they were doorways to wisdom. Now, when pain returns, you don't panic, you listen. You ask what it's teaching instead of what it's taking. This is the silent alchemy of the soul, transforming suffering into meaning, confusion into clarity, endings into thresholds. Slowly, the fragments of your inner world begin to reorganize themselves. You start living with more awareness, less urgency. Relationships shift, not because others change, but because you did. You no longer need validation to feel whole. The emptiness that once frightened you now feels like sacred space. You learn to trust uncertainty, to rest in not knowing. The old map no longer works, but you no longer need it. You walk guided not by plans, but by presence. You realize finally that you never truly lost yourself. You only lost the versions that no longer serve your becoming. The career that collapsed, the relationship that ended, the identity that dissolved, they weren't punishments. They were passages. They stripped away what was borrowed so that what was eternal could breathe again. This is a quiet triumph of individuation. To live not from fear or duty, but from the center of your being. And as you stand in this new landscape, you understand what all the pain was pointing toward. The beginning was disguised as the end. The breaking was the birth. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was a sound of something sacred rearranging your life from the inside out. What looked like ruin was revelation. What felt like dying was divine redesign. Because what once seemed like the end was never destruction. It was your soul asking for more space to grow. If this message resonated with you, comment below. I choose to grow beyond what I planned. And continue your journey of self-discovery and inner freedom by watching the next episode.